Welcome to the mysterious casebook where every whisper hides a secret. Tonight, a quiet village trembles as ivy creeps over something best forgotten. Who buried the truth beneath those tangled leaves? Pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. The church bells of St. Giles had scarcely ceased their soft chiming when the sound of polite applause rippled through the vicarage garden. The annual harvest tea, a modest affair of sponge cakes, cucumber sandwiches, and genteel compliments unfolded with all the serenity of English respectability. The tables gleamed beneath the low September sun, and the ivy that cloaked the vicarage wall trembled faintly in the afternoon breeze, its glossy leaves whispering like confidants. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, her knitting bag at her feet, watching with mild amusement as Mrs. Price Ridley attempted to organize the raffle with the authority of a general. To her right, the vicar's wife fluttered anxiously about the tea urn, fretting over the proper strength of the brew. Everything, as usual, was proper, and yet, beneath that pleasant murmur of village life, a faint unease hovered, like a draught from an unseen door. It began with the ivy. From the furthest corner of the garden, where the wall rose high behind the potting shed, came a dull, cracking sound, not loud, but sharp enough to draw a few startled glances. A fragment of old masonry dislodged itself, sliding down through the thick green leaves. Then a voice, thin and shaken, cried out. Within moments, half the village was gathered near the crumbling wall, whispering, clutching their cups, faces bright with alarm and curiosity. Miss Marple, moving with quiet composure, reached the spot just as Mr. Pritchard, the churchwarden, stepped back, pale and trembling. The ivy, torn away by eager hands, revealed what had long been hidden in a cavity in the wall's foundation. There, half buried among roots and stone, was a human hand, pale, rigid, unmistakably dead. No one screamed precisely. There was instead a collective intake of breath, the moral gasp of a village confronted with indecency in its most unseemly form. The vicar crossed himself. Mrs. Price Ridley fainted rather neatly into the arms of the curate. Miss Marple gazed at the discovery with quiet gravity. "Ivy," she murmured softly, "is such a curious thing. It conceals everything so patiently until it doesn't." The police were summoned from Much Benham, and Inspector Cray, a large, sandy man with an expression of habitual skepticism, arrived an hour later. By that time, the body had been uncovered by a man, middle-aged, well-dressed once, though his clothes were now faded with age and damp. No one could say who he was. No one, apparently, had ever been missing. "Looks to have been here a good while," said Cray, bending low over the remains. Strange no one noticed before. "The ivy grew thick," offered the vicar, his voice unsteady. "The wall hasn't been touched since before the war." Cray grunted, unconvinced. "Before the war, eh? Bodies don't just appear in church gardens by themselves. Someone knew he was here." Miss Marple, standing a few feet away, looked mildly thoughtful. "Yes," she said softly, "and someone hoped he would not be found. But ivy," she added almost to herself, "has its own sense of time." Already the speculation had begun. Mrs. Hartnell, recovered from her faint, insisted that it must be poor Mr. Ellison, the solicitor's clerk, who had disappeared mysteriously in 1939. Mrs. Lumley countered that the clothes were far too fine, more like a gentleman's. Young Tom Henderson, ever eager to impress, suggested a foreign spy. The word spy drew gasps and a delighted ripple through the assembled company, for nothing is so invigorating to an English village as a whiff of intrigue. Miss Marple listened to it all without comment, her eyes resting for a moment on the ivy itself, its roots sunk deep into the old stone, its tendrils curling in graceful deceit. A perfect emblem, she thought, of village life, charming, sheltering, and quietly strangling. By dusk, the body had been removed. The crowd thinned. Only the faint hum of conversation lingered in the cool air, carrying with it fragments of gossip, already ripening into legend. Found behind the vicarage wall, they said, during the harvest tea, imagine? Terrible for poor Mrs. Weatherby, it was her idea, to plant the extra ivy. Miss Marple took the longer way home, through the churchyard, where the yews kept solemn company with old stones. She had seen enough death in her time not to be startled by it. What troubled her was the quiet calculation that death sometimes required the sort of calm, practical evil that lived, all unsuspected, among tea-tables and hymnals. At the garden gate of her cottage she paused. The last light of evening caught the ivy that climbed her own low wall green, glistening, peaceful. And yet she thought of the hand beneath its twin at the vicarage, of the way it had lain hidden all these years, preserved in silence. From the road came the clip of hurried footsteps. It was young Nancy Hewitt, breathless and pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and excitement. "Miss Marple," she said, "they've found something else in the man's pocket. The constable said it was a letter, or what's left of one." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had drawn from her bag, stilled in her hands. "A letter," she repeated softly. "How very interesting. Letters have such an inconvenient habit of surviving when people wish they wouldn't." Nancy nodded, swallowing hard. "Inspector Cray said it's half-burned, miss, but there's still a bit of writing. They're taking it to the station now." Miss Marple's expression did not change, only her eyes flickered calm, grey, and infinitely perceptive. "Thank you, my dear," she said gently. "That was very kind of you to tell me." Nancy lingered, uneasy, as though expecting more, but Miss Marple merely smiled, a small, serene curve of the lips, and turned toward her garden. She watched the twilight settle over St. Giles, soft and unremarkable as ever, felt not fear, precisely, but a stirring of the mind, a quiet recognition that the ivy's silence had at last been broken. The first secret was spoken. The following morning dawned pale and windless, a thin mist coiling along the hedgerows like smoke from a dying fire. St. Giles was awake before breakfast, and already the vicarage wall, or rather, the space before it, had become a place of pilgrimage. The constable had strung a single length of rope to keep people back, but that only served to make the scene more fascinating. Villagers gathered in respectful clusters, whispering in tones of appalled delight. From her cottage window, Miss Marple watched them come and go, her knitting resting in her lap, her tea cooling untouched. It was curious, she thought, how quickly fear and curiosity took on the same expression in human faces. Every eye that turned toward the vicarage was bright, not with pity, but with speculation. By the time she arrived at the post office for her morning letters, the news had flowered into a dozen versions. Mrs. Lumley insisted the dead man's shoes were continental, proving he must have been a foreign agent. Mr. Spenlow, the retired schoolmaster, swore he remembered a stranger passing through years ago with a limp and a brown suitcase. And at the counter, Miss Finch, who handled telegrams with the gravity of a magistrate, confided that the letter found in the corpse's pocket had contained a woman's writing, though how she knew this no one thought to ask. Miss Marple made no comment. She purchased a sheet of stamps, inquired gently after the price of seed catalogues, and only when Mrs. Lumley leaned closer and whispered, "You must have seen something, Miss Marple, living so near," did she reply with a mild smile. "Indeed, one sees a good deal when one lives long enough, though rarely what one expects." Outside, the air smelled faintly of damp ivy and turned earth. The church bell rang for half an hour, and somewhere a dog barked. The ordinary sounds went on, as though determined to reassert themselves over the extraordinary. Yet an invisible unease threaded through them all, binding the day in quiet tension. At 11, Inspector Cray called upon Miss Marple ostensibly to ask whether she had noticed anything unusual in recent weeks. His manner was polite but faintly patronizing, the way younger men often were when speaking to old ladies. Miss Marple offered him tea, which he declined, and listened attentively as he listed facts. The body male, between 40 and 50, dead at least 20 years. No identifying papers save the half-burned letter. It was sealed once, Cray said, producing a small envelope in a waxed paper bag. The writing's almost gone, but there's a word left that might be darling, might be dearling. Hard to say. How very inconvenient of language, Miss, Marple murmured. It never tells us what we most wish to know, Cray gave her a dry look. You think it tells us something else, then? I think, she said gently, that people often write what they wish others to believe. A letter, like a garden wall, can conceal as much as it reveals. The inspector made a small, non-committal noise and changed the subject. He wanted to know about the vicarage staff, the gardener, the old charwoman, anyone with access to the wall. Miss Marple provided what she knew. The gardener, Mr. Groves, retired 2 years ago. The current man, young and inattentive, had only been there since Easter. The wall itself was ancient, neglected, and thick with ivy planted long ago to hide the damp. When Cray left, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching him stride toward the churchyard. He was thorough, she thought, but perhaps not imaginative. She had learned long ago that evil seldom announces itself with banners. It prefers embroidery, a careful stitch here, a patient concealment there. By afternoon, the village's moral machinery had gone into full motion. Sympathy was divided evenly between the vicar, such a dreadful thing to happen on his property, and Mrs. Weatherby, the shame of it, her ivy of all things. There was also debate on whether the deceased might have been one of those evacuees from the war years, or more darkly, a lover dispatched in some long-forgotten scandal. At the Blue Boar, where the men met for darts and mild indignation, Mr. Pritchard declared it was undoubtedly a case of foul play. No one crawls into a wall and dies there of natural causes, he said, to general agreement. Whoever put him there knew what they were about. Yet beneath the excitement ran something else, a prickle of shame. The idea that such a thing had lain undisturbed for years offended the village's sense of order. Evil, if it must exist, should at least be tidy and well accounted for. That evening Miss Marple was invited to supper at the vicarage. The atmosphere was one of strained propriety. Mrs. Weatherby, her face pale above her lace collar, apologized 3 times before the soup. I do dread, Miss Marple, what people will think. It's horrid enough, but the talk is, well, it's simply endless. I've always found, said Miss Marple mildly, that people prefer to talk in silence. Silence makes them uneasy, as though it expects something from them. The vicar gave her a startled glance, but she merely sipped her soup. Across the table, Nancy Hewitt looked troubled, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "It isn't right, miss," she burst out suddenly. "There's something wicked about it, hiding a man like that behind a church wall, too." "Nancy," said the vicar sharply, but Miss Marple smiled. "It is wicked, my dear," she said softly, though wickedness often begins quite innocently, with the wish to keep appearances tidy. There was a short, awkward silence. The clock ticked. From outside came the faint rustle of ivy against the window-pane. Later, walking home beneath a waning moon, Miss Marple paused once more by the wall. The rope was still there, glinting faintly in the lamplight, a thin and futile barrier against curiosity. She bent to examine the earth where it had been disturbed, a small, clean indentation, as though something had been recently removed. Perhaps a stone, perhaps a relic, overlooked by the police. The smell of ivy was sharp in the cool air. mingled with the faint sweetness of decay. From the churchyard beyond came the low murmur of voices. Two figures moved among the gravestones, one tall, unmistakably the inspector, the other shorter, head covered with a shawl. Miss Marple recognized the outline at once of Mrs. Lumley, in full nocturnal gossip. The old lady turned away before they saw her. She had learned the value of listening without being seen, but as she reached her gate, she found herself thinking of the letter, the blurred word that might be darling or darling, and of how small a difference it took for affection to turn into deceit. Behind her, the ivy whispered in the wind, as though trying to remember whose secret it had kept so long. The ivy's whisper lingered long after Miss Marple had gone indoors. She slept lightly that night, as old people do, her dreams filled with voices that never quite said what they meant. By morning, the village had settled into that peculiar calm which follows excitement and a hush of collective waiting. The newspapers had not yet arrived, but everyone expected them to. At 9 o'clock, the constable knocked politely on her gate to inform her that Inspector Cray was taking statements at the vicarage. "Routine, Miss Marple," he said, though his face betrayed eagerness. "They're saying it might have been someone from the war, or before." "Quite so," said Miss Marple, handing him a wrapped slice of seed cake for his trouble, "and I dare say they're saying rather a lot else besides." The constable reddened and tipped his cap. When she arrived at the vicarage later that morning, ostensibly to deliver a basket of apples, she found the study transformed into a scene of quiet interrogation. Inspector Cray sat behind the vicar's desk, methodically turning pages in a small notebook. Opposite him, the gardener, young Arthur Pike, twisted his cap between his hands. "You were working near the wall that morning, weren't you?" Cray asked. Arthur nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Mending the edging by the gooseberry bushes. Never saw nothing odd till the bit of ivy came loose. Then Mr. Pritchard shouted and everyone came running. No quarrels? No strangers about?" Arthur hesitated. "Well, there was someone asking after the vicar a week ago. Gentleman-like, with a walking stick. Said he'd been here years ago, wanted to see the garden again. I told him the vicar was out and he went off down the lane. I didn't think much of it." Inspector Cray leaned back, brows lifting. "Can you describe him?" Arthur frowned, searching for a memory. "Tallish, sir." "Grey. Hair. Sort of tired look. Wore a brown coat. Spoke nice London, maybe." Miss Marple, standing discreetly near the doorway, pretended to adjust the ribbon on her hat. "How interesting," she said mildly. "The past has such a persistent way of revisiting us, doesn't it?" Cray glanced up, half irritated, half amused. "You have a way of making things sound more mysterious than they are, Miss Marple. I find," she replied, "that mystery often lies in what people fail to notice." He grunted, returning to his notes. Outside, Mrs. Weatherby's voice could be heard in the hall, flustered, brittle. "Inspector, I really must protest at this constant coming and going. My husband is quite exhausted, and the servants refuse to enter the garden." Miss Marple took that as her cue to leave. In the hallway, she met Mrs. Weatherby herself, cheeks flushed, eyes sharp. "My dear Miss Marple," she said in a low voice, "I can't think why they must make such a spectacle of it all. If the poor man's been dead for 20 years, he won't mind waiting another day before being fussed over." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple gently, "but it's rarely the dead who mind being discovered." Mrs. Weatherby stiffened, the faintest tremor passing over her expression before she smiled too brightly. "Quite right. Well, I dare say they'll have it all sorted soon enough." As she walked home, Miss Marple considered that tremor. It was not fear exactly, nor guilt, but recognition of the faint shock of memory. In St. Giles, memory was a dangerous currency. Everyone remembered something, but few wished to pay. At midday, the postmistress arrived with the Morning Chronicle. There it was, neatly boxed on page 3. Skeleton found in vicarage wall. Police investigate Longago mystery. There was talk of a forgotten crime and a letter preserved by chance. It was enough to keep the village alight for another day. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Hartnell under the pretext of borrowing embroidery thread. The sitting room was thick with the scent of lavender polish and suppressed excitement. "Of course, dear Jane, I knew something was odd about that ivy," Mrs. Hartnell began immediately. "It grew much too fast. Foreign plants, you know they never behave properly. Mark my words, there's something continental about the whole affair." "How extraordinary," said Miss Marple, her needles moving calmly. "You think the plant itself might be involved?" Mrs. Hartnell frowned. "Don't be absurd, Jane, but there's no denying it's symbolic of a foreigner smothering a good English wall." "One must consider the moral pattern." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, one must always consider the pattern." When she returned home, the afternoon light had turned soft and slanted. She found a note slipped under her door, folded once, unsigned, written in a neat but hesitant hand. "Please don't let him think I told you. I didn't mean to, but it isn't right to hide it any longer. No name, no address, just the faint scent of soap and violets." Miss Marple read it twice, then laid it carefully beside her knitting. Secrets, she thought, had a way of leaking through the smallest cracks, just as roots find their way through stone. And sometimes those cracks appeared exactly where respectability seemed strongest. She went into the garden and examined her own ivy again. The leaves glistened in the waning sun, perfectly innocent, perfectly deceptive. Beneath them, a blackbird hopped among the flower beds, pecking industriously at the soil. It made her think of human curiosity, never malicious, yet always unsettling what ought to stay buried. The church clock struck 4. Across the lane, she saw young Nancy Hewitt hurrying toward the vicarage, her head bowed, her shawl drawn tight. The girl's posture carried that same tension she had noticed the night before, a guilt unspoken or a fear unshared. Miss Marple watched her disappear through the gate, her footsteps swallowed by the hush of the evening. She had a sudden, sharp sense of pattern, the sort that appeared not through logic, but through rhythm. The echo of the ivy, the letter, the tremor in Mrs. Weatherby's smile, the stranger who came asking after the garden. All threads of something woven carefully long ago. When dusk fell, she lit her lamp and sat down to write a small note of her own to Inspector Cray, politely requesting a look at the damaged letter for reasons purely of curiosity. It was not curiosity, of course, but intuition, that deeper curiosity of the soul which sought not evidence, but meaning. Outside, a wind rose suddenly, rustling the ivy along the wall. Its whisper seemed almost articulate, a sigh of memory stirred too soon. Miss Marple looked up from her writing and listened until it faded, wondering what else the village might yield once silence had begun to crack. The morning post brought Inspector Cray's reply, a terse note, written in the steady hand of a man unused to letters. "Come at 11, Miss Marple. You may see the letter under supervision. Nothing further to add at present." Miss Marple folded it neatly, set down her teacup, and smiled to herself. "Under supervision," she murmured. "Quite right, too. Secrets should never be left unsupervised." At 11 precisely, she was shown into the small reading room at the Much Benham police station. It smelled faintly of dust, ink, and linoleum polish. The inspector was waiting with the relic on the table before him, a fragment of envelope, edges blackened, the paper brittle with age. The writing, though faint, still bore a trace of emotion in its curves. "Not much to go on," Cray said. "We tested the ink's ordinary paper common type. The only thing of note is the stamp, issued in 42, London postmark. That's all." Miss Marple bent close. "And the word inspector?" Darling, we think. Could be dearling, as I said, but nothing else is legible. She studied it in silence for a while. There was something oddly intimate about that single word surviving. The ruin like a whisper carried through years of dust. A letter that says darling once may have said something rather different later, she said softly. Cray gave a short laugh. You think it's love then? Some village romance gone wrong? Love, Miss Marple said mildly, is often the reason people do very foolish things and sometimes very practical ones. He looked faintly exasperated. I suppose you'll tell me next that it's a case of conscience. Oh no, she said. Conscience usually comes much too late. Outside the window, a motor lorry passed, scattering a brief shadow across the room. Craig gathered his papers, but his tone changed slightly to be more deliberate, less official. Between you and me, we've a lead. The gardener's story about that stranger we think may have been connected to a family called Hewitt. Used to live here before the war. Father worked as groundskeeper. Died suddenly. The daughter, still a young woman at the vicarage, helps Mrs. Weatherby. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked faintly in her handbag. Nancy, she said. Do you know her? Everyone knows Nancy. She was confirmed the same year as the Price Ridley twins. Sweet-tempered girl, but sensitive, perhaps a little too easily persuaded. Cray nodded. She's been avoiding us. We'll have her in for questions today. Miss Marple made no comment. She only noticed with inward precision the way he said avoiding, not hiding, not frightened. Avoiding implied guilt that sought refuge in delay, not denial. Back in St. Giles, the air had the crisp, brittle brightness that follows a night of frost. The villagers had already decided on their version of events. In the post office queue, Mrs. Lumley confided that the letter was undoubtedly from a married woman, while Mr. Spenlow declared the body must have been her paramour. It was a comforting conclusion, wickedness neatly labelled and safely remote. Miss Marple smiled faintly and asked for an extra half-pound of sugar. She knew that such tidy theories were the village's defence mechanism, the way decency covered its eyes when decency failed. By noon, the vicarage was abuzz again. The police had come for Nancy Hewitt. Mrs. Weatherby stood rigid in the doorway, protesting her innocence of any impropriety. The girl herself appeared pale and bewildered, her shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. Miss Marple, who happened to be trimming her roses at the front gate, offered a calm nod as Nancy passed. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, a flicker of plea or recognition, gone almost instantly. That afternoon the gossip ripened into certainty. Nancy had confessed. Of what no one quite knew. Some said she'd admitted to knowing the dead man, others insisted she'd burned the letter. By tea time, she had already become a tragic heroine in miniature, pitied, condemned, and sentimentalized in a single breath. Miss Marple, meanwhile, paid a quiet visit to the church. Inside, the air was cold, the scent of polish and candle, wax mingling with damp stone. She sat for a time in the last pew, letting the silence settle. It was a silence that held layers of reverence, habit, and beneath it, unease. When she rose to leave, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Weatherby. The vicar's wife was flushed, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. The girl has made the most shocking admissions." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "People often confess to things they didn't do, Mrs. Weatherby, particularly when they wish to protect someone else." Mrs. Weatherby faltered. "But who could she possibly be protecting?" "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is precisely the question to ask." There was a moment's silence, broken only by the creak of the old pews. Then Mrs. Weatherby's composure wavered. "You can't imagine how this has upset my husband. He feels it reflects terribly on the parish." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Death, I've found, seldom respects parish boundaries. Outside, the ivy on the church wall shivered under a sudden gust, scattering a few dark leaves onto the path. Miss Marple bent to pick one up, glossy, perfect, and flecked faintly with white dust from the vicarage wall. The symbol did not escape her beauty, nourished in decay. That evening, Inspector Cray called at her cottage. He looked tired, his coat smelling faintly of rain and tobacco. "She's admitted she wrote the letter," he said. "Claims she was trying to warn the man about something. Says she burned the rest herself when she realized he'd never posted it. Foolish business, really. We'll have to check the handwriting, of course." Miss Marple offered him tea. "And the man?" she asked quietly. "Still unidentified. No dental records, no missing persons that match. But she says he was someone called Mr. Ferrars who worked for her father years ago and came back looking for money he said was owed to him. She denies knowing he was dead, but it's a tangled tale. I don't trust it." Miss Marple stirred her cup thoughtfully. "It's seldom wise to trust the first story told by a frightened person. They tend to tell what they wish were true." He gave her a searching look. "You think she's lying?" "I think," she said softly, "she's telling the truth in the wrong order." When he left, the night had drawn in thick and low. Miss Marple stood by her window, gazing at the faint outline of the vicarage through the mist. Somewhere behind those walls the roots of this thing went deep, deeper than gossip, deeper even than guilt. The ivy swayed gently in the wind, its shadow trembling across her garden wall. Miss Marple watched it move dark upon dark and wondered how many hands it might have hidden and how many hearts it still covered, pretending to be harmless. The mist hung over St. Giles like a veil, softening edges, muffling sound. Miss Marple remained at her window long after the inspector's footsteps had faded, her thoughts weaving slowly through what she had heard. She was not one for excitement or premature conclusions. She preferred the quiet work of alignment, seeing where the pattern failed to fit. The story of Mr. Ferrars, as told by Nancy Hewitt, had a faintly rehearsed quality. Not dishonest, perhaps, but smoothed like a well-handled coin. It had, Miss Marple thought, the careful polish of self-protection. The next morning she decided to walk to the vicarage under the pretext of returning a borrowed hymn book. The lane glistened with overnight rain. Ivy leaves shone darkly, each droplet a small mirror. At the vicarage gate she paused, noticing something curious. A faint mark in the mud beside the wall, where a foot had slipped and caught against the stone. It was fresh, not 24 hours old. Someone had been there after the police departed. Inside, the vicar's wife received her with the fragile graciousness of one determined to appear unshaken. "My husband is resting," Mrs. Weatherby said, pressing her palms together. "He has taken this whole business most grievously to heart." "I can quite imagine," said Miss Marple gently. "It is never easy when a place meant for faith becomes the keeper of secrets." Mrs. Weatherby's composure trembled. "Do you really think it was someone we knew? I cannot bear the idea that such wickedness might have brushed our lives." "Wickedness," Miss Marple replied, "has a very old habit of brushing respectable shoulders. It doesn't always leave a mark one can see." The conversation ended when the maid entered with tea. Miss Marple accepted her cup, her eyes resting unobtrusively on the girl. Nancy Hewitt had returned from the station. Her face was drawn, her manner subdued, but steady. There was something new about her, the fragile poise of someone who had passed through humiliation and found a sort of defiance beyond it. "I do hope they haven't kept you long, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "No, miss," Nancy murmured. "Inspector Cray just wanted the truth. That's all anyone ever says they want." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though truth, like ivy, is never quite where one expects to find it." Nancy glanced up sharply, as if something in the comparison had touched her. But before she could reply, Mrs. Weatherby interjected briskly about the state of the garden and whether the police might at least have had the decency to tidy up after themselves. As Miss Marple took her leave, she passed through the side gate into the kitchen garden. The wall loomed ahead, that same wall which had once been background and now was stage. The ivy drooped under the weight of rain, the soil still churned where the body had been unearthed. Near the base, something glinted faintly in the mud. She stooped, brushing aside a leaf. A small brass button lay half-buried plain, but of good quality, the sort once found on an officer's coat. She slipped it into her glove. It might, of course, be nothing but an old fastening from a gardener's jacket, a remnant of some bygone uniform. Yet it gleamed too cleanly for a relic, 20 years forgotten. That afternoon she called upon Inspector Cray, who looked harassed and faintly triumphant. "We've confirmed the girl's handwriting," he announced. "Letters hers beyond doubt. As for the rest, it's all sentimental nonsense talk of debts and promises. She claims the man was threatening her father. Convenient, considering her father's dead." Miss Marple listened, then drew the button from her glove. "I found this by the wall. Perhaps the gentleman was more military than mercenary." Cray examined it. "Army issue. Officer's tunic, maybe. Still, it could have been there for decades." "Of course," said Miss Marple mildly. "But isn't it curious that something metallic should survive so bright? When paper turns to dust..." He grunted. "You think someone planted it?" "I think," she said, "that time and conscience sometimes conspire to bury what they cannot burn." He frowned, uncertain whether she meant the button or the body. When Miss Marple left the station, she walked through the churchyard, where the yews stood dark and dense, a robin perched on a gravestone, pecking at something white. It was a scrap of paper, half a page, torn roughly from a notebook. She stooped, curiosity stirring again. The writing was smudged, but she could read a line, "Cannot risk the vicar knowing. Too dangerous now." No signature, no date. But the paper smelled faintly of lavender polish, the same scent that lingered in Mrs. Weatherby's drawing-room. She folded it carefully. Coincidence was not a thing Miss Marple dismissed, but neither did she trust it. Coincidence was often the disguise of design. That evening she entertained herself with her knitting and her thoughts. There were patterns here, threads crossing and recrossing the brass button, the lavender paper, the stranger's visit, and behind them all that insistently polite anxiety from Mrs. Weatherby, as though her fear were not of murder, but of exposure. The church bell struck 8. Across the lane a light flickered in the vicarage study. Through the thin veil of mist she could just discern a figure of the vicar himself bending over his desk. He moved with the heavy weariness of a man who carries more than sorrow. A soft knock startled her. When she opened the door, Nancy stood there, a pale shawl clutched tightly around her. "I shouldn't come," the girl whispered, "but I had to tell someone. They've got it wrong. Mr. Ferrars, he wasn't after money. He wanted proof. He said there was something hidden in the church, something that would ruin the vicar if found." Miss Marple drew her gently inside. "And you believed him?" Nancy nodded miserably. "He showed me a paper once. I thought it was only gossip from some old scandal, but he said it would destroy everything. Then he went missing. I thought he'd gone back to London." "And when you heard of the discovery?" "I knew it was him." Her voice cracked. "But I can't tell the police that. They'd think please don't let them think I killed him." Miss Marple took her hand. "My dear, murder is a thing of intention, not accident, and secrets, they have their own kind of poison. Better to let them breathe a little than let them fester under ivy." The girl's tears glimmered in the lamplight. "You don't believe me?" "Wickedness," Miss Marple said softly, "is rarely found where one expects. It prefers respectable company. Nancy managed a faint smile through her fear, thanked her, and slipped away into the fog. When the door closed, Miss Marple remained still, listening to the faint rustle outside, not of footsteps, but of leaves shifting against stone. Somewhere beyond her hedge, a figure moved away toward the vicarage, dark against the whitening mist. She thought she recognized the gait deliberate, stooping slightly as though accustomed to bending beneath invisible weight. The brass button lay on her table, gleaming like a solitary eye. She turned it over once in her palm, then set it beside the scrap of lavender-scented paper. 2 fragments of the same story, she suspected, but which part was deceit and which part confession? The wind rose again, brushing the ivy against the glass, in a slow, rhythmic whisper, as if the wall itself were trying to remember. The faint whisper of ivy against glass gave way to the sound of the village clock striking 9. Miss Marple rose from her chair and extinguished the lamp. The mist outside had thickened into a gauzy drift, swallowing shapes, softening sounds. Yet she could still make out the silhouette of the figure retreating toward the vicarage, the dark coat blending into the grey. There was purpose in that movement, not panic, the quiet determination of someone returning to something unfinished. The next morning dawned sullen and still. The newspaper, when it arrived, bore no mention of the case, only a line about renewed police inquiries. The village, however, had not lost interest. Miss Marple could sense the tension like a change in air pressure, the hush at the bakery, the overpolite greetings in the lane, the lowered voices when Nancy Hewitt's name was spoken. Respectability, once dented, was swift to repair itself with judgment. At 10:30, Inspector Cray called again. He looked unusually grave. "We've made another discovery," he said, removing his hat. "Your vicar seems to have been holding something back?" "Indeed," Miss Marple folded her hands. "That is seldom wise for a man of the cloth." Cray's mouth twitched. "He came to us this morning, claiming a confession of sorts. Says he found a box hidden under the vestry floor. Years ago, personal letters, receipts, the sort of thing you'd rather not see daylight. Burned them all, or so he says. The name Ferrars appears in one of them." "How awkward," murmured Miss Marple. "Ashes always have a way of clinging." He frowned. "You think he's lying?" "I think," she said gently, "he's trying to choose the least damaging truth." Cray hesitated. "We're bringing him in for questioning later, quietly, but I'd like to hear what you make of this." He placed a small cloth parcel on her table. Inside lay a signet ring, dull with age but unmistakably fine. The crest was faint, a bird of prey clutching a branch. "Found it in the same soil where you picked up that button." Miss Marple studied it carefully. Curious. The button spoke of service, but this of lineage, 2 very different forms of pride, and perhaps 2 men. He gave her a searching look, half frustrated, half intrigued. "You really believe there were 2? "I believe," she replied, "that sometimes one life wears another like a borrowed coat. It may fit, but not for long." After he left, she sat for a while in quiet reflection, the ring gleaming faintly on her table. The emblem stirred a memory not of heraldry, but of a story told long ago at a women's institute meeting a disgraced officer, a quarrel over inheritance, a broken engagement hushed up for propriety's sake. The details were hazy, but the tone of shame wrapped in courtesy was unmistakable. It was the tone of St. Giles itself. That afternoon, Miss Marple decided to call upon Mrs. Weatherby again. She found the vicar's wife in the drawing-room, sitting rigidly with a Bible open on her lap and a cup of untouched tea beside her. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish and nervous sweat. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look quite worn out. Have you been troubled by callers?" Mrs. Weatherby closed the Bible with a snap. Inspector Cray has been most inconsiderate. He came early before breakfast, said he must speak with my husband about some box, as though we kept contraband in the vestry." Miss Marple's tone was mild. Perhaps he merely wished for clarification. "He wished for scandal," Mrs. Weatherby said sharply. "They always do." Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup. Miss Marple noticed the faint imprint of a ring on her third finger, a mark where something had been recently removed. "I do so dislike unpleasantness," Mrs. Weatherby went on, her voice thin with strain. "I told my husband that secrets only invite evil, but he insists the past must remain buried." "Buried things," Miss Marple said softly, "have a disagreeable habit of growing roots." For a moment, Mrs. Weatherby stared at her as though the words had been aimed too precisely. Then she rose abruptly. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I must see to the flowers for the altar." Miss Marple inclined her head and let her go. When the door closed, she took one slow turn about the room. The faintest draught stirred the curtains. On the writing desk lay a folded paperweight, glass clear, and beneath it a half-sheet of notepaper bearing a single phrase in a man's hand, "Destroy all, for both our sakes." She left it untouched, but memorized the writing, the slant of the S, the faint tremor in the pen stroke. Then she made her way out through the side passage. The ivy along the outer wall caught her attention again. A small portion had been freshly trimmed, the stems cleanly cut. Beneath them, a narrow wooden door, half concealed by foliage, to the disused coal cellar, a door she did not recall seeing open before. Kneeling, she brushed aside leaves. The padlock was gone. The ground before it showed the faint scuff of recent shoes, larger than Nancy's, heavier. Whoever had come in the night had been here. That evening, she invited Inspector Cray for tea, ostensibly to discuss the ring, but in truth to observe him thinking aloud. He arrived punctual, though visibly weary. "It's getting deeper," he said grimly. "The vicar cracked, admits he knew Ferrars, claims Ferrars once worked under his patronage, some charity business gone wrong, says he came back threatening to reveal old misdeeds." Miss Marple poured the tea. Misdeeds seldom travel alone. Did he mention who else was involved? Refused to name anyone, only said he couldn't bear to ruin a woman's name? Cray gave a short laugh. "Always a woman in these stories, isn't there?" "Not always," said Miss Marple. "Sometimes the woman merely stands too near the fire." He looked puzzled, but she did not elaborate. After he left, the house fell into silence again. The lamp's glow pooled softly on the brass button, and the signet ring lying side by side, symbols of two intertwined fates. Outside, the fog pressed close to the windows, distorting the faint outlines of the vicarage beyond. A single light still burned there, low and steady. Someone was keeping vigil. Miss Marple sat a long time before bed, her knitting idle in her lap. The words from the vicar's desk echoed in her mind, "Destroy all for both our sakes." They carried not malice but fear. And fear, she knew, could make the righteous do the most unholy things. At last she rose, drew the curtains, and placed both objects, the button and the ring, into a small china dish beside her teacup. The wind stirred faintly at the panes. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, followed by hurried footsteps on gravel. The night, it seemed, had not yet finished speaking. She listened until the sound faded, then turned down the lamp. The ivy outside tapped gently, insistently, as if reminding her that silence was never truly still, it only waited to be disturbed. The night's hush fractured with the slam of that unseen door. Miss Marple stood motionless by the curtain, listening to the rhythm of the footsteps fading down the lane hurriedly, unevenly, carrying the echo of decision rather than panic. A clock chimed midnight. The sound threaded through the fog and was swallowed whole, leaving behind only the soft, persistent scratching of the ivy against the glass. By morning, the stillness felt wrong. Birds sang fitfully, the usual chatter of milk carts and cyclists came, muted, wary. Miss Marple sensed it before anyone said a word, that subtle change in the air which precedes disaster. When she stepped out to fetch the paper, Mrs. Lumley was already hurrying down the lane, her hat askew, cheeks pink with exertion and gossip.
"Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard of it? It's too dreadful that the vicar's gone missing." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Missing? Vanished before breakfast." Mrs. Weatherby found his bed unslept. "And oh, it's too awful. They say the police have been all morning in the churchyard." "Really?" said Miss Marple, her tone mild, though her heart had already drawn its own outline. How industrious of them! Within the hour, the village was in a state of fevered civility. People spoke in whispers that carried farther than ordinary speech. The Blue Boar's door opened and closed constantly, dispensing rumour-like communion. Inspector Cray's motor car was seen parked by the lich gate, while the constable stood guard near the ivy wall as if it might grow another corpse. By mid-morning, Miss Marple walked up the path to St. Giles, her expression one of unobtrusive concern. The churchyard was a flurry of activity, constables marking ground, villagers gathering in scandalized sympathy. Cray looked up as she approached. His face was set, his voice curt. "You have the worst kind of timing, Miss Marple." "I often find it's the best," she said gently. "You found something, then?" He hesitated, then gestured toward the open crypt door. "We found him there, the vicar, not alive." Her eyes softened, not with surprise, but with quiet sorrow. "Ah," she said. Then our ivy whispered again. Cray frowned. "You have a poet's way of putting things, Miss Marple. But I'm afraid there's nothing poetic about this." He'd been there for hours, maybe since last night. Shot himself by the look of it. Old revolver from his study. Left a note, too. Miss Marple's hands rested on the clasp of her bag. Notes, like letters, often tell the story people wish to remember. And what does this one say? Short. "Forgive me, the past can't be hidden forever." That's all. Concise, she murmured. As confessions go, quite efficient. Cray sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. It's going to be a circus. A clergyman died, a body dug from his wall, and the wife near hysterics. The poor woman kept saying he was ill, overworked. I don't buy it. "Neither, I think, do you?" Miss Marple said softly. He looked at her sharply. "You mean you think it wasn't suicide?" "I mean," she said, "that guilt comes in many shapes. Some people end their lives because of what they've done, others because of what they fear will be done to them." Cray made no reply, but his eyes darkened with thought. By afternoon, the vicarage had fallen into funereal quiet. Curtains drawn, door closed, the scent of lilies already heavy in the hall. Mrs. Weatherby received Miss Marple with a distracted air, her composure frayed beyond repair. "He's gone, Miss Marple," she said hollowly. "My husband is my dear Henry, and now they're saying dreadful things." That her voice failed. Miss Marple guided her gently to a chair. "People always say dreadful things when they do not understand. It comforts them to believe in
Wickedness more than in weakness. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her handkerchief. He wasn't wicked. He made mistakes. Yes, who hasn't? But Henry only wanted peace. That's why he burned those papers. There were letters years old from that man Ferrars. Accusations, demands, nothing true, nothing he could bear others to see. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And yet Ferrars came here, not for money, I think, but for vindication. Mrs. Weatherby flinched. "You don't know what you're saying." "Oh, but I think I do," said Miss Marple gently. "It's terribly hard, isn't it, when the truth and one's duty are not on speaking terms." The woman's lips trembled. "He did it to protect me," she whispered, almost to herself. Miss Marple said nothing. Silence, she knew, was often kinder than pity. Outside, the sky had turned the colour of pewter. Rain began to fall in fine, slanting threads. She took her leave as discreetly as she had come, but before turning down the lane, she paused by the churchyard gate. The ivy wall looked darker now, almost black against the wet stone. A constable stood there, guarding nothing and everything. At her cottage, she found Nancy waiting, pale, rain-soaked, her shawl clinging like a second skin. "It's my fault," the girl blurted out as soon as the door opened. "If I hadn't told you, if I hadn't said anything, he might still be alive." "My dear," Miss Marple said, drawing her in, "truth never kills anyone. It only removes the disguises people die wearing." Nancy's eyes filled. "You don't understand. I saw someone last night by the church, after you'd gone in. I was frightened, so I hid behind the hedge. It wasn't the vicar. It was Mrs. Weatherby. She had something heavy in her hands." Miss Marple's knitting slipped unheeded from her lap. "And what did she do?" "She went toward the vestry door. I thought she was just going to pray or something, but then I heard a noise, like metal striking stone. And when I looked again, she was gone." The clock ticked faintly in the silence that followed. Miss Marple rose, crossed to the mantel, and lit the small lamp. "It's always very difficult," she said at last, "to know whether one has witnessed the act itself or merely its rehearsal." Nancy stared at her. "You mean she?" "I mean nothing, child," Miss Marple interrupted softly. "Except that we must be careful now. Appearances, like ivy, can cling to innocence until it suffocates." The girl covered her face with her hands. "What shall I do?" "Do exactly as you have been doing, nothing at all. Leave the speaking to those who listen better than they talk." As Nancy left, Miss Marple stood at her window again. The rain had ceased and the clouds hung low and heavy. Across the lane, the vicarage windows were dark, all but one. A solitary candle burned in the upper room, wavering against the glass. It might have been a vigil or a warning. Miss Marple watched it flicker until it went out. In the hush that followed, the ivy stirred once more its movement, slight but persistent, as if something beneath it had begun to shift again. The faint stirring of the ivy faded into the deeper silence of night, a silence that seemed to breathe with thought. Miss Marple did not move from the window for a long time. The candle's extinguishing had felt deliberate, almost courteous, the kind of act performed by someone who wished not to be seen, but wished even less to appear to be hiding. By dawn, a chill clarity had come over the village. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving the air brittle and sharp. Life went on with exaggerated normality. The baker opened his shutters, the postmistress swept her step, but beneath the daily rhythm was a taut expectancy, like the hush before a confession. Miss Marple took her tea in the small parlour, eyes on the two objects still lying in their dish, the brass button and the signet ring. They glinted faintly in the early light, relics of pride and service, twin emblems of honour corrupted by concealment. She considered them as one might consider cards in a game one hadn't meant to play, but now must win by observation. Alone. At 10 o'clock she went to the church, ostensibly to deliver flowers for the altar. The constable on duty, young and overawed, let her pass with a deferential nod. Inside, the air was cool, the echo of recent tragedies still clinging to the stones. She arranged the flowers with delicate precision, daisies, pale and unassuming, for humility, then turned to where Inspector Cray stood near the vestry door, speaking low with another officer. He looked tired, but not defeated. "I should have known you'd be here," he said. "You've a talent for turning up just when I'm about to be confused." "Then I shall do my best to be confusing in return," she said pleasantly. "May I see the vestry?" He hesitated. "There's nothing left to see. We've taken everything for evidence, the revolver, the note, all of it. Nevertheless, Miss Marple said, there is always something left. A draft, a scent, a pattern. Cray sighed, but yielded, gesturing her through. The small chamber was, as she expected, neat, dignified and disturbed. The floor bore faint scratches where something heavy had been moved recently. The smell of gunpowder lingered faintly beneath the polish. And there, on the small reading stand, lay the open prayer book, its ribbon marking the psalm for forgiveness. "Do you suppose," she asked softly, "that a man intent on ending his life would have paused to open his Bible at the proper place?" Cray frowned. "You think someone staged it?" "I think someone wanted it believed," she replied. "There's a difference." He studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "All right, Miss Marple, suppose you're right. Suppose it wasn't suicide. Who then?" She did not answer immediately. Her gaze had shifted to the window above the desk, its sill streaked faintly with mud. "Someone who knew where to find the key to this room," she said at last. "Someone who moved comfortably in the vicarage at night. Someone to whom he would open the door without fear." Cray's brow furrowed. "You mean his wife?" Miss Marple did not contradict him, but her silence was eloquent. That afternoon she invited Mrs. Weatherby to tea, a gesture of compassion that in St. Giles was indistinguishable from interrogation. The vicar's widow arrived dressed in sober grey, her manner subdued but carefully composed. She spoke of practical arrangements, condolences, and the dreadful intrusion of journalists. "How merciless people can be," she sighed. "They forget he was a good man at heart." "Goodness," said Miss Marple, "is seldom simple. Like the ivy, it clings sometimes for shelter, sometimes to strangle." Mrs. Weatherby's cup rattled faintly on its saucer. "I wish you wouldn't speak of that plant. I intend to have it all cut down. Horrid, creeping thing." "Ah, but it's very English," Miss Marple murmured. "We like our sins draped in greenery." A strained silence followed. Then Miss Marple leaned forward, voice low and almost tender. "My dear, I know about the box in the vestry, and I think I know why it frightened your husband so much." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes widened, her lips parting in a soundless protest. "He feared exposure," Miss Marple continued gently. "Not for himself or for you. There were letters, weren't there? From a time before your marriage? Perhaps from a man who loved you too much to let you go quietly." The widow rose abruptly, face drained of colour. "You have no right." "None at all," said Miss Marple, unflinching. "But the truth does, and it will find its way, no matter how many walls we build or how thickly we let the ivy grow." Mrs. Weatherby sank back into her chair, trembling. "You don't understand. I thought it was over. I thought he'd gone abroad, and that he'd forgiven me. Henry found out years later. He said it didn't matter, but then Ferrars came back." Miss Marple's tone was compassionate but cool. "And your husband decided forgiveness was easier to preach than to practice." Tears welled, catching the lamplight. "Ferrars threatened to expose me to the letters, the child that never was. Henry burned the evidence, but Ferrars wouldn't stop. He came that night to the garden wall. They argued. Henry said he left him there alive." "And you believed him?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "I wanted to." A log shifted in the grate, scattering sparks. Miss Marple's knitting lay idle on her lap, the needles crossed like slender swords. "And last night?" she asked quietly. "When you went to the vestry?" The widow's eyes flew open. "How ivy leaves on your shawl," Miss Marple said gently. "And mud on your shoes this morning. They tell their own story." Mrs. Weatherby pressed her hand to her mouth, a small sound escaping half sob, half confession. "He wouldn't sleep. Said he couldn't bear the shame any longer. I thought I could help him, persuade him to wait, to pray. But when I got there, he was already dead." I couldn't let them think not after all. We'd survived. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly. And so you made it seem as though he had chosen peace over guilt. The woman nodded, shaking. I only wanted to protect what was left of our life. Appearances, said Miss Marple softly, are such faithful servants until the moment they turn on us. Mrs. Weatherby buried her face in her hand, the room filled with the delicate ticking of the clock, a quiet, relentless measure of truth. When at last the widow had gone, Miss Marple sat alone for a long while. The evening light slanted gold across her table, glinting off the signet ring and the button as though they shared a secret language. Somewhere outside, the ivy rustled again, not restlessly this time, but with the slow, contented sigh of something that had been heard. She rose, extinguished the lamp, and looked once more toward the vicarage window. It stood open now, the curtains stirring faintly in the dusk. The truth, she thought, had finally found a way in, but she could not yet see what it would cost. The faint movement of the vicarage curtain drew Miss Marple's gaze for several minutes, until it stilled completely. Only then did she sit again, folding her hands in her lap, with the calm of someone who has come to a conclusion she would rather not have reached. Outside, the last of the light drained from the sky, leaving the ivy a deeper black against the wall. There was peace in the village, but the kind that settles only after something irrevocable has shifted. When she rose at dawn the next morning, she had already decided what must be done. She wrote 2 letters, one to Inspector Cray, requesting his presence at her cottage for tea, and another shorter, handwritten in her neat, slanted script, addressed to Mrs. Weatherby. The first was factual, the second compassionate. She posted them herself before breakfast, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. By mid-afternoon Cray arrived, punctual as ever, though his eyes betrayed the exhaustion of too many nights without rest. "You said you had something for me," he began, removing his hat with habitual impatience. "Not something," said Miss Marple. "Someone." She nodded toward the sitting-room. Mrs. Weatherby sat within, pale but composed, gloved hands folded on her knees. Between them on the small tea-table lay 2 objects, the signet ring and the brass button. Cray's expression tightened. "I hope this isn't what I think it is." "Probably not," said Miss Marple, "though what one thinks and what one wishes to think are rarely identical." She motioned for him to sit. "I believe it's time we spoke plainly, Inspector. The truth, you see, has been standing just outside the room, like a nervous parishioner, waiting to be called in." Cray exhaled. "Go on, then. The body found in the wall," Miss Marple began quietly, "was indeed Mr. Ferrars, the man who returned years later to reclaim a debt that was not of money but of reputation. He came at night, and there was a quarrel. But it was not the vicar who silenced him." Mrs. Weatherby flinched, her hands trembling. "Please," Miss Marple continued gently, without accusation, "your husband confronted him, yes? But another joined them, someone who had more to lose and less patience for forgiveness." Her eyes moved to Cray. "Ferrars was struck from behind. The blow came from a cane, a heavy one, carried habitually by a man of some authority. The vicar's cane, perhaps, but not his hand." Cray frowned. "You're suggesting that the vicar took the blame in silence." "His wife found him later, distraught, and helped to conceal what she thought he had done. She could not bear to let the world see him disgraced, nor herself exposed, as the reason for his fall." Mrs. Weatherby's voice broke in a whisper. "But it was my fault, all of it." Miss Marple's gaze was kind but firm. "No, my dear, guilt is rarely divisible so neatly. The blow was struck by your husband's curate, the man later promoted to a living in Much Benham, now conveniently distant. He was young then, ambitious, and far too devoted to you. He had read the letters Ferrars brought. He thought he was protecting your honour. In truth, He was protecting his own illusions. Cray stared. That's a bold claim, Miss Marple. Do you have proof? I have the shape of proof, she said. The ring belonged to Ferrars that you've confirmed, but the button belonged to a clerical coat of the sort worn by the curate, not by the vicar. I recall his uniform well. He used to visit the Women's Institute garden party in precisely that coat, its buttons shining like badges of humility. Vanity is a treacherous tailor, Cray's brows knit. And you think the vicar knew, eventually? The curate confessed to him years later, not from remorse, but from fear of discovery. They buried the matter beneath their ivy wall, each complicit in silence. When Ferrars' remains surfaced, the vicar saw that the past had returned for them both. His note, "Forgive me, the past can't be hidden forever," was not suicide's farewell, but conscience's epitaph. Mrs. Weatherby's eyes glistened with the effort to remain composed. And I believed he'd taken his own life because of me. Miss Marple reached across the table, her hand gentle on the widow's. In a way, he did. Each act of concealment is a small death, and your husband had been dying, very politely, for years. Cray sat back, his expression thoughtful. And the curate? He will come, Miss Marple said simply. He must. Guilt is a tireless traveller, and he's run out of parishes to hide in. As if on cue, there was a knock at the door. Cray rose quickly, signalling to the constable waiting outside. When the door opened, a tall man entered, grey-haired, clerical collar, fastened with care, though his face was drawn and his eyes hollow. "Reverend Hale," Miss Marple greeted softly. "You've been very patient these many years." He stopped short, gaze moving from her to Mrs. Weatherby, then to the inspector. "So it's come to this," he said quietly.
I wondered how long it would take. Cray's tone was brisk. "You'd better start explaining." But Miss Marple interjected, her voice as calm as Sunday rain. "I believe, Inspector, that Mr. Hale has been explaining himself to God for quite some time. We shall hear a shorter version." The man looked at Mrs. Weatherby with something between pity and resignation. "He was hurting her," he said simply, with cruel, filthy words. "I only meant to stop him. He fell, that's all." "And you let another man carry the blame," said Cray grimly. "I let him forgive me," Hale murmured. "He said it was God's will that silence should serve mercy. We both believed it then." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him, steady and unblinking. Mercy, when misapplied, has a dreadful appetite. It devours truth first, and men soon after. No one spoke for several moments. The clock struck the hour, delicate and final. At last Cray rose. "You'll come with me, sir, quietly." The clergyman nodded as though relieved. "Yes, quietly. It's what we've all been doing, isn't it?" When they had gone, the cottage felt very still. Mrs. Weatherby sat motionless, her eyes on the cold teacup before her. Miss Marple poured fresh tea, the gesture almost maternal. "You see, my dear, evil seldom begins in violence. It begins in courtesy, the courtesy of not saying what must be said." The widow gave a low, trembling sigh. "Will they hang him?" "I dare say not," Miss Marple said softly. "Time has already done most of the hanging." Outside, the bell of St. Giles tolled the hour again. The sound rolled over the village, solemn, cleansing, and faintly mournful. Miss Marple watched the ivy through her window. It gleamed darkly in the rain, its leaves glistening with new water, its roots sunk deeper into the softened earth. And in that moment she thought how human lives resembled those leaves, each trying so hard to appear evergreen, while all the while feeding on the walls that held them up. The sound of the church bell lingered in the air like a held breath. Miss Marple remained by the window long after the last note faded, watching the rain bead along the ivy's edge. Each droplet trembled, caught between falling and clinging, as though even the weather shared the village's hesitation to let go of its guilt. By the following morning, calm had returned with almost suspicious neatness. St. Giles, that tidy kingdom of small courtesies, resumed its rituals with renewed determination. Curtains that had been drawn for morning were briskly opened. Gossip that had been whispered with pity now bloomed in full, perfumed confidence. It was remarkable, Miss Marple thought, how swiftly people accepted a scandal once it had acquired the dignity of conclusion. She went to church as she always did. The service was sparsely attended by a handful of villagers who felt it respectable to be seen there, and Mrs. Weatherby herself, veiled, composed, almost translucent beneath the morning light. Inspector Cray sat 2 pews behind, hat in,
hand expression neutral. The curate from Much Benham, of course, was absent. Officially, he was assisting the authorities. Unofficially, he was the subject of every murmured sentence that began with, "It's a pity." The vicarage choir sang uncertainly, their voices rising and falling like hearts unwilling to commit to contrition. Miss Marple listened, her expression serene, but her thoughts moved elsewhere through years and motives, through what was said and what was meant. After the service, the villagers spilled into the churchyard, the rain having stopped at last. The air smelled of wet stone and hyacinth. Mrs. Hartnell, resplendent in black satin, approached Miss Marple at once. "Of course, my dear Jane, one mustn't be uncharitable, but really, to think our own vicarage was involved in such dreadful goings-on, it's positively Shakespearean. I said to Colonel Lumley only this morning that wickedness often begins at home." "How observant of you," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "and how comforting to know it ends there, too." Mrs. Hartnell blinked, uncertain whether she'd been complimented or corrected. "Well, yes, quite. Still, we must be grateful to have it all settled. One cannot bear suspense forever." Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes were distant. "Suspense is often only truth biding its time, my dear." Leaving her to puzzle over that, she made her way through the graves toward the ivy wall. The constable's barrier had been removed. Only a patch of disturbed earth marked the place where the body had lain. Spring weeds already sprouted through the loosened soil, small green shoots reclaiming their territory. She knelt, brushing her fingertips lightly against the damp stone. The ivy's roots were thick and strong, their grasp unbroken even by violence. She found herself wondering whether the wall would remember if, in its slow, vegetal way, it kept the echo of what had been hidden there. "Morbid spot for reflection, Miss Marple," said Inspector Cray behind her. His tone was gentler than usual. "Not morbid," she said, rising, "merely instructive. Nature never buries what it cannot make use of. It transforms." He smiled faintly. "Then I hope it can make use of this business. I can't say it's been much nourishment for anyone involved." "You underestimate the village," she said. "It thrives on moral fertilizer." Cray chuckled, though without humour. "You're a sharp woman, Miss Marple. Sometimes I wonder why you never joined the force." "Because, my dear Inspector," she replied with perfect mildness, "you have to obey orders, whereas I merely obey truth." He regarded her for a moment, his expression softening. "You were right about him, Hale. He's confessed in full. No argument, no theatrics, just exhaustion." Said the silence was heavier than the crime. "Silence usually is," Miss Marple murmured. "He'll serve time, but not long. The Crown doesn't care much for hangings after 20 years. And Mrs. Weatherby? Well, they'll leave her alone, I think. Public sympathy and all that. The poor woman's punishment began long before the law was noticed." Miss Marple nodded. "Forgiveness can be rather cruel when it's the only thing left to give." They parted at the gate. Cray walked down the lane, shoulders hunched, while Miss Marple turned toward her cottage. The sky had cleared entirely now. A thin sunlight fell across the hedgerows, lending the damp fields a deceptive cheerfulness. Inside, she found Nancy Hewitt waiting, not weeping this time, but quiet, calm, her face newly serious. "They've let me go, Miss Marple," the girl said. "The inspector said I wasn't in any trouble, but people kept looking at me as if I'd started it all." "In a way, you helped to end it," Miss Marple said. "That's a rare achievement." Nancy hesitated. "Do you think God will forgive the vicar and his wife, and the other one?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear, I think God has more practice in forgiving than we do. The difficulty lies with us. We're so reluctant to stop judging." The girl bit her lip. "I keep seeing that wall. I can't forget it." "You shouldn't," Miss Marple said softly. "Forgetting is what allows such things to happen again. Remembering is safer, even when it hurts." Nancy nodded slowly, then rose to go. At the door, she turned back. "Do you ever wonder, Miss Marple, why you always see what other people don't?" Miss Marple's smile deepened, touched with irony. "Because other people look for wickedness in grand gestures, my dear. I've lived long enough to know it prefers the small ones." When the door closed behind her, the cottage settled into its usual quiet rhythm, the clock ticking, the kettle humming faintly, the garden birds beginning to chatter again, as if scandal no longer concerned them. Miss Marple sat by the window, taking up her knitting. The pattern had been interrupted days ago, yet her fingers found the rhythm easily, looping, tightening, releasing the domestic mimicry of fate's patient design. From her chair she could see the ivy wall, just visible between hedges. In the sunlight it looked almost benevolent, its leaves glossy, innocent, untarnished by the horrors beneath. She thought of how people in St. Giles would tell the story in years to come, softened, rearranged, with guilt redistributed to fit the village's sense of justice. The dead would be pitied, the living forgiven, and the ivy would go on growing, its roots fed by the quiet nourishment of secrecy. Miss Marple smiled not happily but knowingly. Appearances, she reflected, were like her knitting. They could be pulled undone with one sharp tug. Yet somehow they always began again, another pattern, another pretense. The kettle began to whistle softly, an ordinary sound almost comforting. She rose to pour the water, humming under her breath, but as she turned back toward her chair, she noticed something glinting faintly at the window ledge, a fragment of brass, no bigger than a thumbnail, half hidden beneath a curl of ivy that had crept in through the open pane. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. It seemed the ivy, after all, still had one more secret to share. The gleam on the window ledge caught Miss Marple's eye like a whispered reminder. She set down the teapot and moved closer, her movements deliberate, precise. The brass fragment was thin as a fingernail, dull along the edge, but bright where the light struck it clean. She lifted it carefully with the corner of her handkerchief. Not quite a coin, not quite a clasp, perhaps the final flake of something once whole. For a long moment she studied it in silence, the faint smell of ivy drifting through the open pane. It was not evidence of guilt that had already been accounted for. Rather, it was evidence of endurance, the way the past shed itself slowly, one glinting remnant at a time, as if memory refused to be buried altogether. She placed it in her sewing box beside the button and ring. 3 tokens, each the relic of a story that could never be wholly told. Outside, the day stretched calm and unsuspicious. The villagers of St. Giles had decided to be cheerful again. They were, after all, a people devoted to the principle that moral tidiness must follow moral disturbance. The baker had resumed whistling. Mrs. Lumley had ordered new curtains to banish the atmosphere. Even Mrs. Price Ridley had sent out invitations for a charity tea to restore Christian fellowship. Miss Marple could not begrudge them their amnesia. Forgetting was the village's way of protecting itself and perhaps its form of forgiveness. But she herself did not forget. Forgetfulness, she often thought, was the only sin that required no confession. By afternoon the sun had settled into that mellow warmth peculiar to early spring. She took her knitting basket into the garden, seating herself beneath the rose arch where the shadows fell dappled across the grass. Beyond her hedge she could hear the vicarage bell being tested by a temporary curate, a nervous sound, uncertain whether it announced redemption or rehearsal. A knock at her gate interrupted the rhythm of the day. Inspector Cray stood there, hat in hand, his expression unusually gentle. "I thought you might like to know," he said. "It's done. Hale's to be remanded to London tomorrow. No fuss, no crowds." He seems almost grateful. Miss Marple nodded, motioning him through the gate. "Sit down, Inspector. You look rather as though you've been scolded by your conscience." He gave a rueful smile. "Perhaps I have. I keep wondering if it would have been better not to know the truth at all. The village was happier when it thought the vicar a saint." "Happiness," said Miss Marple mildly, "is a fragile thing to build on deceit. It collapses like a badly risen sponge." He chuckled. "You make it sound like theology and baking are one and the same." "In their better moments," she said. "They are." He fell silent, eyes on the garden. "I can't help pitying the wife," he said after a while. "She's going away to relatives, somewhere in Devon. Says she'll start over. Funny thing, isn't it? Starting over at her age." "Not funny," Miss Marple said softly, "only very English. We prefer to begin again rather than to admit we've ended." Cray looked at her with genuine curiosity. "And do you, Miss Marple, don't you ever tire of it all? These sad little dramas, this endless peeling back of what people hide?" She smiled faintly, eyes following a bee's lazy circuit among the primroses. "No, my dear Inspector. I find people endlessly educational. One must study something in one's old age, and botany and wickedness grow in much the same soil." He laughed quietly, but there was respect in it. "You know, they should give you a badge for services rendered." "I should prefer a new T-Cosi," she said. "Badges invite conversation." When he left, the garden seemed to absorb the stillness again, as if even the air approved of quiet endings. She gathered her knitting, but before going indoors she paused once more at the wall. The ivy had begun to send out new shoots, tender, bright, already searching for the surface to cling to. Its patience humbled her. The world always resumed its creeping, however violent the pruning. Evening came softly. In the vicarage the windows glowed like lanterns behind gauzy curtains. Life, stubborn and ordinary, was returning. Somewhere a piano played the hesitant notes of a hymn. The melody faltered, recovered, and went on. Miss Marple lit her lamp and prepared a solitary supper. Her cottage, with its neat cushions and unambitious furniture, had never felt more companionable. The clock ticked, the kettle murmured the scent of thyme drifting from the window-sill pot. She thought of Mrs. Weatherby, of the curate, of all the people who had mistaken silence for safety. On the mantelpiece, her 3 tokens lay where she had placed them. They gleamed faintly in the lamplight, as though aware that their story was finally over. She regarded them with the same affection she reserved for her roses, after pruning, grateful for what they had revealed by what they had lost. As the hour approached 9, she drew her shawl tighter and sat by the fire. Outside, a slight wind rose, carrying the rustle of ivy once more against the glass. It was a familiar sound now, neither ominous nor comforting, simply truthful. She smiled, her eyes half closing. "Dear me," she murmured, "the village will be dreadfully dull until the next harvest tea." The clock chimed, the fire sighed. And in that quiet room, the ivy whispered its last secret, that life, like leaves, renews itself by letting go.